Everyone, and welcome to the 41st Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can work with delegation in Cocoa. So we've already seen a little bit about how delegate methods work in the NSTableView series, where the NSTableView asks the app controller via data source methods, which are delegation basically. It asks the app controller for specific data, and then the app controller can return whatever it wants. So the whole point of this, though, is that the view, or the NSTableView, doesn't actually contain the user information. That is stored in a separate section, which are the model objects. So you might remember that we had an NSMutable array with different person objects, and those person objects are the data that can be saved when we actually go to, maybe save that into a file. So all the data is in one central location, so all those model objects are in an NSMutable array in that case, and the app controller just returns these model objects to the view so that the view can display them. The whole point of this is that Cocoa revolves around the MVC design pattern, which again is the model view controller, and the whole point is that the view does not know actually what data is contained. It simply just asks for it so that it can display that information. So the views should never actually contain user data. They always just request it, and that is really how MVC works. So delegation is really a huge part of that process. But in this tutorial, we're going to go through an example of how we can set this whole thing up. So basically, this is what our application will look like when it's done, except for this green stuff and this border that's just stylistic to show that that's the view. But anyway, the point is we're going to have this slider and a view, and the view is just going to display a bunch of random squares all over the place. Now, what the slider controls, though, is the square count, or the number of squares that are going to be displayed in the view. So how do we implement this in our application design? Well, this is where delegation really comes to use. So instead of saying, well, when the slider is updated, we'll set some value in the view so that it knows how many things to change. And that might seem like a logical reason, but if you ever had to save this information for another time, or if you ever had to branch this out into multiple views, then things can get really complicated. You got to update every view object, or if you got to save this information, you got to get the information from every view. It's not ideal. The ideal situation is that the slider will send this data to the app controller, and the app controller will just hold the data, or the model object, in itself. So it'll hold an int called square count, and whenever the views need to know this information, whenever they're updated via maybe this slider, or they're updated, maybe the view has changed size, whenever they need to redraw, they can then ask again for the number of squares that they should display. And so this is the reason that we use delegation, is so that all the data is in one place, and then the views just need to ask for the data so that they can display it. So how this works is that the app controller will implement this delegate method, and it will just return whatever the view asks for. So it's a fairly simple concept, and it's a little more difficult to actually implement in code, but it's not too hard to understand why we do it. So anyway, let's go ahead and just start dragging stuff out here. So we, new Cocoa project, just drag out a horizontal slider. The minimum value is going to be 1. Just go into the attributes inspector here. The max is going to be 50. We'll set a start point to be 10. And with that, we'll then go and add actually one more thing that we should check is the continuous checkbox, so that it continuously sends the message to update its values. Then the next thing is, of course, our custom view. So we'll drag that out. And there we go. And this is, of course, going to be that nice square view that's going to display all those squares. So let's go ahead and start adding some files here. So we'll go ahead and add this square view, and we'll just add that to the project like so. And then with that, we'll just go ahead and also add our app controller. So NSObject, app controller, and we'll add that. And there we go. So now that we have those two files, we can go ahead back into our main menu nib, and we'll add those classes to these different objects. So we'll call this the square view. So now we've changed our square view to in our custom view there. And we'll also add, of course, the object to the workbench, whatever the heck they call that thing. And that object is going to be an app controller. All right, so now that we have all that, we'll come back to this later to add our IB outlets and such, but let's get on to the important part, which is the delegation. So how do delegate methods work? Well, basically a delegate is just a protocol. It means that anything that's going to be a delegate for this object has to adhere to a specific bunch of rules, or in this case, these methods that it's going to have to implement. So if something is going to use the square view requires that it gets some information somehow. So in this case, basically all that we're going to do is we're going to set up a protocol within the square view header file itself. And this is usually what we do if you want a specific protocol inside for a specific class. So in this case, we're going to create a protocol called square view delegate. And you could probably call this data source, and that would probably actually be the more appropriate name, but I'm just going to call it delegate since we're working with delegation in this tutorial. So anyway, we're going to create our square view delegate or square view data source, and basically we're going to be asking the app controller or whatever is going to be our delegate for the number of squares. So we're going to ask for some int value in return. We'll call it number of squares in square view. And for this, we're going to pass a square view object on and just call it square view. All right, so you might be wondering why we added this little last part, and you'll see that it's also complaining about having this right now, and the reason for it is that the square view is actually defined down here, and so we technically haven't defined what square view is yet in this file all the way up here. I know it's hard for the file to understand that, or the compiler or whatever goes through this, but basically just to ignore this warning, we say @class square view, and that just tells this section, or tells the compiler that the square view does exist, so stop complaining. All right, so now that we have this delegate, again, this delegate just sets up a protocol, meaning that anything that's going to be the delegate for our square view has to implement this method. And so this will be, anything that goes to try to set itself as the delegate will be notified that it should implement this method. So that is the protocol that anything has to conform to once it becomes the delegate for our square view. So how do we set something to be the delegate though? So in our app controller, we're going to basically say, well, our app controller is going to become the delegate for this square view. And so to do that, we basically just have to create a property, and we're going to make some kind of delegate property here. So it's going to be a weak attribute for weak property, since it's simply just connecting to the delegate. Since the square view doesn't actually own the app controller, it has no ownership over it, so we just want to have a weak relationship basically. So it's just going to be weak. And if you're using Snow Leopard though, that would just be a sign, since weak properties don't actually exist. All right, so now when we're creating our delegate, the delegate could be any object, right? So we want to make it of type ID, but it doesn't want to be any object. It wants to be a specific object that adheres to the square view delegate. So we can just say it's going to be a type ID that adheres to the square view delegate, and we'll just call it delegate. And this is usually always what you call it. So this isn't, just my naming convention. This is pretty much what I'd never seen it really called anything else. So anyway, now that we have that, the delegate is there, and of course we have to synthesize this as well. Synthesize delegate. All right. So now, just to kind of recap what we did, we make a protocol for our delegate. This just means that anything that's going to become the delegate for our square view has to implement whatever this protocol is. So again, this happens because whenever something tries to set itself as the delegate, it's going to it has to be adhering to this protocol. And so we're gonna know that when we go to compile this. So anyway, now that we have that good stuff, let's go ahead and try implementing some things in the app controller. So the app controller, we're going to add our, I just built the project, but anyway. So we're going to add our square view IB outlet and our IB action as well. So we'll say @class and square view. I don't know why this isn't color coding it for me, but I had the same problem when I tried to do this before. But anyway, I don't know what's going on. But nonetheless, let's keep going with this. So we have our @class square view. We're going to have to change this in a little bit, but anyway, we'll leave it for now. But we're going to have a property, and it's going to be weak for an IB outlet of square view. All right, so now that we have that, we're also going to create an IB outlet, an IB action. It's going to be called change square count, and of course it's going to be ID sender. And I don't know why this isn't auto-completing for me. It's kind of frustrating, but anyway, you'll probably get the nice auto-completion stuff. But nonetheless, we can head back over to our main menu nib here. And over in our app controller, we can right-click it and make the connections. So we have an IB outlet to our square view and an IB action to the slider to change the square count. All right, so now that we have all that good stuff implemented, we can go on to the implementation section of this. So in the app controller implementation, we're going to add a instance variable like I was showing you in the diagram to indicate the square count. So we'll say int square count, and that will be just a value that we hold on to so that we can keep the number of squares. So that is like the model object, like I was saying earlier. So the next part is to actually implement our other method, so change square count. Whenever change square count is called, that's when the slider is adjusted. So that just means that the square count is going to get the sender's, which is our slider's, int value, like so. All right, so now that we have that, there's a few more connections we have to make here. So of course we have our square view and we have our app controller, but we haven't specified that the square view's delegate is going to be the app controller. So we can do this in awake from nib. And you can technically do this if you can do this in interface builder as well if you make an outlet for it in the square view, but we're going to be doing this in code for this tutorial. So this is showing you how you can set up the square view or the app controller to be the delegate of this specific square view. So if we go ahead and let's go ahead and implement our square view, since I forgot to synthesize it. So we'll synthesize our square view. We'll also have to import that file. We're going to have to change this around in just a bit, but you'll see why. But anyway, we have our square view now, and we'll say get square view. All right, so now we can say square view set delegate, and the delegate is going to be ourselves. And so you'll see when we do this, it's going to suddenly complain here. And it's going to complain that basically, we don't actually adhere to this square view delegate. We don't actually work for this. So how we can change this around is that we have to say that we're going to implement this square view delegate method, right? Or the square view delegate protocol. We're going to conform to that. So to actually get the protocol though itself, we have to import the square view file here. So instead of using the @class, you have to import square view. And if you import it there, you don't import it here. So you get rid of the square view import statement in your implementation. But anyway, we import our square view.h here, and we say that we're going to conform to the square view delegate. So now our app controller is set to go, and we're going to implement ourselves. Now you'll see though that we get a new warning now which says incomplete implementation, and you'll see that it's saying the method in protocol is not implemented, which means we didn't implement that protocol that we said we're now adhering to. So we said we're going to implement the square view delegate, we better darn well implement it. So we can go ahead and say number of squares in square view, and we don't care what our square view who's sending this because we only have one. We're not being specific, so whatever square view sends us this message, we're just going to return the square count, and that's just the int value that we had for whenever our center is updated. All right, so last few things that we're going to do for this, these are kind of piggy things that we have to do, but we just have to set our square value, our square count, to be 10. And I know that's not really something we care to do, but we'll also say square view set needs display, and that will just update our value. And in what you'd usually do for this, instead of just setting square count to be 10 originally, the only reason I'm doing this is so that I don't have to create an IB outlet for our slider. But in reality, you would want to create a slider IB outlet and then set the square count to be whatever the IB outlet is to start. But anyway, or vice versa. So anyway, the square count we're just going to set to be 10, since that's what I said. The slider is going to start as 2. And then we just say set needs display here, because obviously, we are starting, we just set the square count, so we want to redraw whatever that value is now. So now that we have that, the last thing for this is that we also have to change, or we also have to set our square view to be updated whenever our slider values change. So we have to say square view set needs display yes here as well. All right, so now that we have that, the last step is to go back and do all the nice little drawing code. So if we go to our squareview.m, let's implement our nice DrawRect method here. And I'm going to kind of bring this down just so I don't have to have all that space down there. All right, so in our DrawRect, what we're going to do is just draw some random squares all over the place, right? So what we want to do for this is, first off, we want to figure out what our color is that we're going to be drawing in. So we'll say NS color, and we're going to use our red color, and we'll set that. And you've seen this many times already. The next step is to figure out how many squares we're going to actually draw. So we'll say int num gets, and we're going to ask the delegate for the number of squares that we're going to use. So we're going to say delegate number of squares, and we'll send ourself as the square view that's asking. Not that it matters though. We could pass in nil and it wouldn't make any difference. But anyway, number of squares in square view, that's going to ask the delegate for this value. And of course our app controller is going to return the square count. So now the square view here, we're going to just loop through whatever the number of the number that's returned. We're going to draw that many in our for loop here. So we'll say int I get 0, I less than num, I plus plus, and this is just going to draw however many number of squares we're supposed to draw. So to get random positions of the squares, we can just say float x. We're just going to get random x and y values for this. So float x. To get random values in Objective-C, we always use arc for random. It's basically just a better, you don't have to seed anything for getting random values. It's the random number generator that we always use, basically. So random number generator basically generates a giant random number, and by using the modulus, we can simplify, or not, we can get the remainder basically of a specific set of numbers. So if we say mod, we want to figure out some value from 0 to the end of our screen. So we want to figure out the size of our view. And to do this, we can just say self.frame.size.width. And we're going to say that all these rectangles are going to be a size of 20. So since we don't want our rectangles to go beyond that, we'll just subtract a value of 20 when we're done. And since we always need to, if we're using mod, we need to use int for this. So we're going to use, we're just going to typecast our frame value here, or our width, I should say, which returns a float, and we'll typecast it as int so that it doesn't complain about that. All right, so we'll just copy this over now for y. So we'll copy, and we'll paste. And if you didn't really understand the random section, this is actually, I talk about random numbers in the C tutorials, so if you don't know what I'm doing there, check out the C tutorials for that. And so now we want to fill some kind of rectangle, so we'll say nsRectFill. And since we don't really have a rectangle, we'll just say nsMakeRect. nsMakeRect. We'll take the x value, no, take the X value, take the Y value, take the width, it's going to be 20, take the height, it's going to be 20, and that is basically all we have to do. So we've just implemented everything that we need to get this to work, and let's hope for the best. So we'll go ahead and run this. Compiling. Run, do. And here we go. So now you can see that as we adjust the slider value here, and obviously I goofed on the size of my squares, but anyway, as you can see, as we adjust the slider value, and the reason, hold on, let me go and fix that. Obviously, when I'm copying and pasting, I'm being dumb, and my height shouldn't be the same as my width, obviously. So anyway, let's go ahead and rerun this. So we'll rerun, and as you can see, as we move this slider around, we get more and more squares, and as we move it to the left, we get less and less. And of course, all this happens because of delegation. As we move this slider along, we're calling our slider to send the IB action. It updates the model object in our app controller, which is our square count. And it also tells the view to redraw itself. Every time the view redraws itself in our DrawRect, it's going to be called, it asks the delegate for the number of squares. And so the delegate returns the square count. And the square count is sent back to us. And so as we move the slider, we now know how many squares to display. And this works as you move it around like so. You get more squares, etc. So anyway, that's how that works. It's very simple to implement. The only really key parts here: we create a protocol, adhere to the protocol in the controller or whatever object is going to control that, and you just set your delegate to adhere to that particular protocol. And the last important step is really to just set the protocol. So in your app controller, you make sure that you set the delegate to be yourself, or in this case, our app controller is telling our square view it's going to be the delegate for the view. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions on what we did in this tutorial, because I know it's a fairly big concept, feel free to leave your questions in the comments below, and I will see you in another upcoming tutorial.